The house was huge, with tall windows, shabby columns, and a dilapidated roof with lichens growing on it. Sagging plants hung from its facade, and dark windows watched their every move. The winds seemed unable to penetrate this house. Its walls were as if to swallow up all living things around it. The windows, though dusty, looked as if someone was watching them from within. "This isn't the place for us," Tim said, but his voice shook with excitement. Nevertheless, Jake, confident in his abilities, moved forward. He pulled Marie with him, who was growing more tense with each step. She felt the air grow dense, and everything around her lost its usual liveliness. She tried to ignore the strange restlessness, but her heart wouldn't stop beating faster. Despite her inner doubts, she followed. When Jake opened the old door, the sky darkened and there was silence inside the house. The dark, moist air filled their lungs immediately, and footsteps on the old floor echoed in the empty rooms. The floors were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture gave off the odor of long-forgotten days. But what alarmed them most of all was the absence of any sign of animals. In houses where no one had lived for a long time, one could always find at least spiders or mice, but here it was as quiet as a grave. Casey has always been fascinated by old architecture and abandoned places. She was drawn to the idea of unraveling the hidden secrets of old houses and the stories they held. This time her attention was drawn to an abandoned manor house standing on the edge of the forest. The locals had long avoided the place, and the stories about the house were full of mysticism and secrets. It was said that people once lived there, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and after their disappearance the house became a place where people did not dare to enter. Strange figures were often seen in the windows, and footsteps were heard at night, even though the house had long been abandoned. Casey had come there looking for answers, determined to solve the mystery. She was ready to investigate the abandoned manor and prove that all these rumors were just made up by the locals. However, the closer she got to the house, the stronger the feeling of unease became. The manor stood surrounded by a dense forest, and only the narrowest of country roads led to it. The whole atmosphere around the house was strange and frightening. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. When she finally reached the manor house, her heart jumped. The house looked grand but old and ruined. The tall columns, decorated with rust and lichens, were covered in a green patina, and the roof was rotten in places. The windows were broken, and some had sagging curtains. Still, something about this house caught her attention. Casey felt she had to go in to find out more. As soon as she stepped onto the porch, the fog thickened around her and her footsteps echoed across the empty yard. She opened the old door, which suddenly yielded as if someone from inside had opened it just for her. There was complete silence inside. Everything around was covered in dust. The furniture was scattered and half-ruined, as if someone had left everything in a hurry. The feeling that this house held long-forgotten secrets was irresistible. As Casey walked down the hallway, her gaze fell on the walls. They were covered with old pictures and drawings, but the faces on them were blurred, as if someone had purposely tried to hide those faces. On the floor were ancient books and scattered pages with incomprehensible symbols. The whole thing gave the impression that someone didn't want these things to be found. Casey continued her exploration, heading up to the second floor, where the air was colder and the walls were covered in moss. She felt less and less confident with each step, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Suddenly one room caught her eye, where the door was ajar. She entered it and immediately felt a strange atmosphere. In the center of the room stood a large antique mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. However, when she got closer, she noticed that the mirror was not like the others. In the reflection, Casey saw herself, but her face was distorted, as if it didn't belong to her. Startled, her heart pounded faster. She hurried away, but to her horror, she noticed that her reflection in the mirror didn't move in time with her movements. It was mute, as if frozen, and though she tried to turn around, the reflection continued to stare at her without moving. "It's impossible," she whispered, trying to close her eyes. When she looked in the mirror again, it was even stranger. The faces she saw were unfamiliar, and their expressions were full of pain and fear. Right now, Casey couldn't believe her eyes. Those faces were distorted, and everything in the room began to dim. Unclear figures began to appear in the corners, and vague shadows that looked like human silhouettes began to move. She felt her heart thudding in her chest again, and her breathing became heavy. The room was too dark, and the musty smell was becoming more and more unbearable. Her heart jumped as she realized she couldn't find a way out. Her footsteps became more and more panicky, and she ran out into the hallway, hoping to find another way out. But as soon as she turned the corner, she found herself back in the same place she started. Everything kept repeating itself, and Casey couldn't figure out what was happening. The rooms were starting to look the same, the doors were closing, and the house was becoming like a maze. Suddenly, a light whisper came from the darkness and she froze. "You can't leave," whispered a voice that couldn't have come from anyone alive. At that moment, a man appeared out of the darkness. He was composed and strangely calm, but his face was contorted with a sinister smile. Casey backed away, trying to figure out what was going on. The man approached and said, "You shouldn't have come in here. You're here forever now." She recoiled, feeling the walls begin to shrink around her. The shadows moved as if they were coming to life, and the room itself began to pull her into its own abyss. Casey tried to get out, but her legs wouldn't obey, and she felt the cold begin to permeate her body. Suddenly, the door in front of her opened. She jerked to the side, but found herself back in the same place. Only now it was clear to her she was trapped in this place forever. As she struggled to escape through the window, she saw that beyond the walls there was nothing but vast darkness. The forest was gone, the sky darkened, and the place around her was engulfed in emptiness. The house appeared to be alive, and in its eerie corridors, Casey became part of the very horror that haunted those who had once walked into that darkness. She could no longer distinguish where the house ended and where she began. The same whisper sounded in her ears, "You're not getting out of here." When Jake and his friends decided to explore an abandoned house on a hill, they had no idea that it would be their last expedition. The house stood at the very top of the hill, alone, surrounded by a dense forest. The road to the house was winding and almost unremarkable. The locals avoided approaching the house, telling horror stories that several people had once disappeared here. They said that at night, strange figures could be seen from the windows of the house, and laughter could be heard coming from inside. But the most frightening part was that anyone who decided to spend the night in the house disappeared, leaving only empty clothes and muddled footprints. Jake had always been an avid adventurer, and the rumors only fueled his curiosity. He was sure it was all just fiction, but if he'd known what he was about to experience, he might never have taken this step. This time he was joined by Tima and Marie, old friends who also couldn't pass up the chance to explore an unknown place. They took their backpacks with food, flashlights, and a camera to capture the scary moments. But as soon as they began to climb the hill, Jake noticed that the atmosphere around them was changing. The air became strangely dense, as if every breath was heavy, and the trees around them didn't move, as if they were absorbing the light. Nature became mute and motionless. Only their footsteps broke the silence. The whole hill seemed separated from the rest of the world. As they approached the house, Jake felt a strange stirring in his chest. This house wasn't just in. The house was huge, with tall windows, shabby columns, and a dilapidated roof with lichens growing on it. Sagging plants hung from its facade, and dark windows watched their every move. The winds seemed unable to penetrate this house. Its walls were as if to swallow up all living things around it. The windows, though dusty, looked as if someone was watching them from within. "This isn't the place for us," Tim said, but his voice shook with excitement. Nevertheless, Jake, confident in his abilities, moved forward. He pulled Marie with him, who was growing more tense with each step. She felt the air grow dense, and everything around her lost its usual liveliness. She tried to ignore the strange restlessness, but her heart wouldn't stop beating faster. Despite her inner doubts, she followed. When Jake opened the old door, the sky darkened and there was silence inside the house. The dark, Moist air filled their lungs immediately, and footsteps on the old floor echoed in the empty rooms. The floors were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture gave off the odor of long-forgotten days. But what alarmed them most of all was the absence of any sign of animals. In houses where no one had lived for a long time, one could always find at least spiders or mice, but here it was as quiet as a grave. They began to look around the rooms, and with each step the feeling grew more uncomfortable. Jake was the first to head into a room that seemed cozy, with windows covered by thick curtains. It looked as if the owners had just gotten up and left without taking anything with them. There were old books covered in dust on the shelves, and an antique armchair with a worn velvet cover in the corner. Tim walked over to the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the shabby couch and Marie's lost look. He picked up an old photograph from the mantelpiece and gazed at it, but his face became tense. The photograph showed a group of people standing in front of this house, but their faces seemed blurred and their eyes were blank and dark. When Tim looked at the picture again, his face turned pale. He turned to his friends, trying to hide his fear. "This isn't just a house," he said. "It's some kind of strange place." Suddenly, the door to the next room creaked open. Someone or something was clearly moving behind it, and it could be heard through the walls. Jake stepped forward, not thinking of the consequences. He opened the door, and a staircase leading to the basement appeared before them. "Are we going down?" Jake asked, feeling the air growing heavier. "No." Marie backed away, her eyes full of fear. "This isn't right." But Jake insisted. He had long ago stopped believing the rumors. He felt no fear as he stepped into the darkness. When they got downstairs, they found themselves in an empty, forgotten basement where the walls were covered in mold, and the air was so musty it was hard to breathe. The walls were immortalized with ancient marks that seemed scratched out not by hands, but by something that left behind it the marks of an unearthly presence. Tim was the first to notice a figure in the shadows. It was something standing against the wall, indistinct and vague. But when he looked again, the shadow was gone. He turned around, trying to find an explanation, but no sooner had he opened his mouth than the door slammed shut behind them. "We can't get out," he said, feeling his voice grow muffled. Tim tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room was getting more and more cramped. Nothing could explain what was happening until suddenly there was a creak. Marie shrieked, and they all froze. In the center of the room, directly in front of them, a figure appeared, blurred, as if standing in shadow. It didn't move, but its presence felt like a heavy weight. "Who are you?" Jake shouted, but the answer was only laughter echoing through the walls. The figure took a step forward, and when its eyes met their gaze, they were black, as empty as the darkness itself. "You have been chosen," the figure whispered. "You are now part of this place." At that moment, the walls began to shrink. The room became smaller, the air even thicker, and each of them felt their body losing strength. They tried to run, but something in the darkness was holding them back, preventing them from stepping any further. Suddenly, Jake found himself in a different place. He looked around and realized that he was alone now. His friends were gone. The shadow hadn't left him. The house had swallowed them all up, and Jake was part of this sinister place, forever trapped between the walls where no one else would dare to go. Ryan, David, and Leslie were always looking for adventure. They loved to sneak into abandoned places, shoot videos for their subscribers, and solve the mysteries of old buildings. The next target of their night raid was a dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city, which had long been surrounded by rumors. Legends said that a family once lived here, but one day they disappeared without a trace, leaving everything as it was. A table set for dinner, children's toys in the living room, unmade beds. The house was sealed, and years later it was simply forgotten. Now it was the perfect place for their next video. "Ready." Ryan turned on the camera, illuminating the dark facade. "This will be top content." David pulled out a crowbar and easily broke the lock on the front door. He clicked the flashlight, directing the beam deep inside. "It smells like mold," Leslie snorted. "Let's hurry up. I don't like this place." But Ryan had already stepped inside. David followed, then, reluctantly, Leslie. The house was empty, just old furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed for decades. But most striking was the sense of time standing still. A pair of children's shoes on the floor, a cup of dried liquid on the kitchen table, and a bed in the bedroom, as if someone had recently gotten up from it. "It's like people just disappeared," David muttered, looking around. They began to explore. Ryan filmed everything, Leslie peered into the rooms, and David went down to the basement. After a few minutes, he called his friends. "Hey, there's something weird here." As they went down, a weak flashlight illuminated them. In the corner of the basement was a metal door that was clearly installed later than the house itself. "Locked." David tugged the handle. "Maybe they hid there during hurricanes?" Leslie suggested. Ryan took out a crowbar. "We'll find out." The door gave way with a strained creak. The smell was suffocatingly musty. The light picked out a concrete room with a massive table and something resembling traces of dried blood. There were scratches on the walls. "Damn." Leslie took a step back. "We definitely shouldn't be here." But Ryan was already looking at the papers scattered across the table. "These are reports, experiments," he muttered. David picked up one sheet. "What the hell?" Leslie was already at the exit. "We're leaving. Right now." But footsteps were heard from above. They froze. Someone was walking around the house. Ryan turned off the flashlight, gesturing for silence. They listened. The footsteps slowly descended to the first floor. Then, even lower, to the basement. Someone was there. David looked around frantically. "Back, back," he whispered, dragging his friends into a dark corner. The basement door opened. The flashlight in Ryan's hand was shaking, but he didn't turn it on. In the darkness, they heard quiet breathing. Someone had entered. The footsteps slowed.